Okay, let me get started. So we're back for our second day of the 25th meeting of the Retirement Research Consortium annual meeting. I want to welcome you back. My name is John Leitner. I'm the director of one of the four research centers, the Michigan Retirement and Disability Research Center, that make up the RDRC. And I'll be your host today. I think while people join, I'll take just a minute to recap yesterday's program. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. So we had 3 sessions of reports on research projects. The first one was on disparities by race and ethnicity. We had a paper on the distribution of wealth, and today's keynote talk will pick that topic up again. We had an excellent paper on the functioning of the U.S. pension system and the tax expenditures and so on that are involved. And we had a third paper on assessment of possible disparities in SSDI awards by gender and race. The second session, again, we had 3 papers. So the SSDI application trend had been upward, but in recent years, it's turned and gone down. And we had a paper analyzing the change in the trends. And we had a second paper where the author had a subsample of people who were self-identified as disabled but had not applied for SSDI. And she had interviewed them about their reasons. And then we had a third paper using the HRS data on life histories of jobs, and the authors looked at the descriptions of the jobs and asked whether it was correlated with people's health status late in life and their age of retirement. And then we had a paper on communication with various subgroups of the population and outreach by SSA. And we had a paper on the comparison of consumer satisfaction with the Social Security retirement system and other alternatives. We had an interesting paper on possible problems reaching out to specific subgroups in the population, maybe people who weren't as eager to use the internet as others. And we had a third paper on an internet panel and the importance of question wording for reaching out to certain groups and so on. So all in all, we had an excellent program. And if you missed it or want to go back, we have recordings of just about all the research presentations. In a few cases, the authors need to withhold them for publication purposes, but we're going to have most of the presentations up and recorded, and you can go to any of the 4 centers. So, example, you could go to the Michigan Retirement and Disability Research Center at UMich, that'd be UMICH, and in a few days, it'll be there, and you can click on it and go through the sessions if you want to hear the recordings. So, let me turn now to today's program. We have another full afternoon for you here. We're going to have a keynote address to start, and then we'll have 3 sessions as before. In each case, remember, if you want live captions, you can go to the bottom of your screen and use the CC function. And during the presentations, if you want to make comments or ask questions, you should go to the Q&A and type it in. And I can't guarantee that we'll get to all of these, but we'll try. So our keynote address. Our keynote speaker today is William Darity. William Darity is Distinguished Professor of Public Policy, Economics, African and African American Studies at Duke University. He has a PhD from MIT. His research spans a wide range of topics, including economic history, development economics, economic psychology, and the history of economic thought. His research focus is inequality by race, class, and ethnicity. Professor Darity's topic today is understanding American economic inequality. This is a 35-minute slot. I've taken up 5 minutes of time, but we'll have the slot run 5 minutes longer to 12:40. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, William Darity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to explore issues concerning wealth disparities in the United States, particularly wealth disparities that are intergroup in character. And so my focus is going to be on emphasizing the distinction between wealth and income. I'd like to begin by pointing out that when many studies are done where people refer to wealth inequality, they're frequently actually talking about income inequality. It's pretty much a commonplace that if you do a Google search on wealth inequality in multiple countries around the world, you invariably will get a set of articles or reports that are focused on income disparities. So it's important to make that distinction at the outset. So income is a flow of resources that for most people is largely dictated by their earnings. Although there are other categories of income, we can refer to those as social income in the sense of transfer payments that are made by the public sector to individual citizens, as well as for folks at the upper end of the income distribution, resources that are drawn in the form of interest on the assets that they possess. But primarily, income is associated with a flow of resources within a given period of time. Usually we think about annual income. In contrast, wealth is a stock of resources that an individual can carry with them over time. It's the difference between what an individual owns and what an individual owes. We also can think about the concept of wealth as being equivalent to the idea of net worth. That is the difference between the value of an individual's assets and the value of their debts, or correspondingly, the net value of their personal property. I'm going to argue that actually wealth matters in a way that might even be more significant than income, because wealth provides an indicator of economic opportunity, security, and overall well-being. It functions essentially as an insurance policy against economic shocks, whether this might involve the loss of employment or a medical emergency. In addition to buffering against economic uncertainties, it can facilitate political participation in our society, one in which monetary resources prove to be highly influential in the political process. It is also something that is valuable from the standpoint of enabling families to purchase their way into high amenity neighborhoods. It enables them to provide their sons and daughters with high quality schooling. If they're not able to move into a neighborhood that has associated with it a high quality public school, they can use their resources to purchase education privately. So they have a lot of choices that are associated with their access to higher levels of wealth. In addition, if confronted with the criminal legal system, they have the capacity to purchase quality legal counsel. And furthermore, Wealthier families have the capacity to deliver gifts and bequests to future generations to ensure their degrees of economic security and economic opportunity. So wealth can replace lost income, but lost income can rarely replace lost wealth. So I'd like to talk about the extent of wealth inequality in the United States, and I'd like to move from thinking about the general or overall degree of wealth inequality to thinking about racial inequality in wealth. So I'd like to share with you at the beginning a diagram that I refer to as the double fin fish diagram. And the double fin fish diagram displays the process of alteration in wealth inequality over the course of approximately 70 years that has resulted in a situation in which the United States now has the same degree of wealth inequality as the degree that existed during the course of the Great Depression. Okay. So if you look at the blue curve in the diagram, that represents the share of the nation's wealth going to the bottom 90% of the population. The red curve represents the share of the nation's wealth going to the top 0.1%. So this is not the 1%. This is not even 10%. This is the 0.1%. So the degree of concentration of wealth in the United States is actually quite staggering. You can see that the bottom 90% of the population at this point in time has approximately the same share of wealth as the top 0.1%, somewhere in the vicinity of 22 to 23% of the nation's wealth. Okay. I'd like to give you a sense of the comparative difference in income and wealth inequality that is emphasized in the previous diagram. You'll note that income inequality is quite substantial in the United States as well, but wealth inequality is even more intense and concentrated. So the bottom 90% of the income distribution has about 50% of the nation's income. The top 0.1% has 11%. But if you contrast that with the estimated shares of wealth going to the respective categories, the bottom 90% and the top 0.1%, we see, as was demonstrated in the previous diagram, a convergence in the vicinity of 23 or 22%. A striking statistic that's reported at the base of this diagram is the fact that the 400 richest people in the United States own more assets than the 150 million Americans in the bottom 60% combined. So now I'd like to make a transition to thinking about the disparities in wealth at the intersections of race and gender. So I'd like to propose two ways of thinking about the Black-white wealth gap in the United States based upon two very standard measures of averages. So let's start with the median differential in wealth between white and Black households, where the white households' median level of wealth is represented by the gray rectangle, and the Black household's median level of wealth is represented by the black rectangle. Correspondingly, we also have information about the mean differential in wealth between Black and white households, where again, the white level of wealth, or the white household level of wealth, is represented by the gray diagram or the gray rectangle, and the Black level of mean wealth is represented by the black rectangle. And it becomes very, very apparent that even though the ratios are similar, the ratio of white to Black wealth, the dollar disparity is substantially greater if one is focused on the mean differential. If you were going to close the wealth gap measured at the median, which would be the middle household in each of the groups, it would take somewhere in the vicinity of 3 to 4 years of consecutive zero expenditure by Black households out of their income to save a sufficient amount to close the racial wealth gap. On the other hand, if you're looking at the comparative differential at the mean, it would take 14 consecutive years of zero consumption out of the income that households receive to eliminate the racial wealth gap. So the mean differential is obviously far larger and a more challenging target from the standpoint of any kind of policy initiative that's designed to try to close the gap. Now, you frequently find observers who are thinking about wealth inequality in the United States focusing on the median gap. And the rationale for doing that is that the median gap is not contaminated by outlying values, extreme values in the distribution. But I'm going to argue that if we are thinking about wealth differentials by race in the United States, we actually should focus on the mean gap, which is considerably larger, and again is a more challenging target from the standpoint of policy initiatives to eliminate the gap. And I'm going to argue that this is a consequence of the high degree of concentration of wealth in the United States. That's precisely why we should focus on the mean rather than the median. So the first statistic that I would like to share with you, which is relevant to this comparison of the mean versus the median, is the fact that 97% of the wealth that is held by white households in the United States is held by those households that have a net worth above the white median. 97% of the wealth. So that means that for white households in the lower half of the wealth distribution, they possess about 3% of the total amount of wealth that is owned by white households. So if you were to focus on the median gap, you are essentially ignoring large portions of the wealth differential that's relevant to our estimation. Now, let me also add that gap in wealth is not attributable merely to the fact that there's a handful of white billionaires. There are a handful of extraordinarily rich white billionaires, but that doesn't fully explain the differential. In fact, one of the most salient numbers that I think is relevant to this conversation is the estimate that indicates that 1/4 of white households have a net worth in excess of $1 million, while that is true for only 4% of Black households. Here's a corresponding diagram that illustrates the issue that I'm trying to raise here. You can see that the sharp separation in wealth shares by race, it becomes evident when you move beyond the 50th percentile of the wealth distribution. However, to the left of the 50th percentile, the overlap that is displayed in this diagram because of its scale is somewhat misleading. In fact, if you look at the bottom 20% of income recipients in the United States, the lowest income recipients, or the folks who we might say are the poorest Americans, we find that the median level of wealth for white households is somewhere in the vicinity of $15,000, while it is zero for Black households. So even in the lowest income categories in the United States, we still have sharp differences in wealth They're just not as pronounced as the dramatic differences that are illustrated as you move above the 50th percentile of the wealth distribution. This is a diagram that I think is particularly salient in the context of some of the presentations and conversations that were held yesterday, which is a diagram that demonstrates that as people get older, the wealth gap between white households and Black and Hispanic households widens dramatically. This is true whether you're looking at the wealth gap measured at the median or you're looking at the wealth gap measured at the mean. Obviously, there's a more pronounced gap that occurs when the estimates are presented at the mean, but the pattern of increased wealth inequality at older ages is present in either case. Now, in this context, I want to emphasize that the within-group distribution of wealth among all ethnic racial groups in the United States is substantially unequal. So it's not only the case that 97% of the wealth for white households is held by those who are above the median, but it's also true for other groups, whether we're talking about Blacks or Latinos collectively. In fact, if you take Blacks, whites, and Latinos and compare the wealth distributions within groups, approximately 75% of all the wealth is held by the top 10% of each group. Similarly, approximately 40% of all the wealth in each group is owned by the top 1%. So if you were to take the wealth distributions for each of these groups and lay them on top of one another, they would almost perfectly overlap. But here's the problem. The proportion of wealth that is held by Black and Latino households is substantially less than the proportion of wealth that is held by white households relative to their population presence. So, for example, Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States, excuse me, constitute about 12% of the nation's population, but possess about 2% of the nation's wealth. So we have a maldistribution of wealth that occurs across all three of the social groups, but the maldistribution for Black Americans and for Latinos is a maldistribution over a disproportionately lower share of the total nation's wealth. Okay. So now let me make a brief transition to thinking about racial differences in wealth that apply at the intersection with gender. And it's particularly interesting to look at women who are elderly, 60 years of age and older, and compare those who have similar educational levels. So here's a really stunning statistic. White women who graduated from college have 35 times the wealth of Black women who graduated from college in this elderly category. So the raw numbers are estimates of $384,000 in net worth in comparison with $11,000 in net worth. Moreover, white women without college degrees have substantially greater wealth than Black women without college degrees, and actually an even greater level of wealth relative to Black women with college degrees. And so, at the intersection of race and gender, there still are substantial glaring differences in the levels of wealth. Tried to make a further adjustment in this analysis by looking at racial differences in wealth among women who have similar family or parental structures. And again, we find that there are substantial differences, even among unmarried women with children, while white women have a relatively low level of net worth, as you can see in the diagram. Black women with children who are unmarried have a net worth of approximately zero. So the disparities are quite substantial once we even take into account differences in family or parental structure. So what causes these disparities in wealth, particularly disparities in wealth across racial and ethnic groups? Well, I think we would have to tell somewhat different stories about the disparities that are associated with Black-white differences from the disparities that are associated with Latino and non-Latino white differences. I've done substantially more research on trying to understand wealth disparities between Blacks and whites in the United States, and less work on the question of the determinants of the disparities between Latinos and non-Latino whites in the United States. So as a consequence, I would like to focus on the former, although I do have some reflections that I could share in the Q&A about the sources of the differences for the latter. And in the work that I've done, the central argument that I've been making for a while is that the key factor that dictates any individual household's wealth position is the intergenerational transmission of resources that they may have received from previous generations. So to put it in a nutshell, the reduced form equation for the current generation's level of wealth is the level of wealth of their parents and their grandparents, and perhaps if we had access to it in a data set, we could actually explore generations further back than their grandparents. But in a data set like the panel study of income dynamics, the best we can do is look at parental and grandparental wealth and what its implications and effects are for the current adult generation. So that said, if we center the intergenerational transmission mechanisms as being at the heart of the disparities that we observe, then the reason why we have racial disparities must be because previous generations of Black parents and grandparents have not had the same amount of resources that they could transmit to subsequent generations. And when I'm talking about resource transmission across generations, I'm actually talking about three different things. First, I'm talking about inheritances. That is the transmission of resources that occurs when the donor dies. Second, I'm talking about something that is typically underestimated in our conversations about intergenerational transfers, which is in vivo transfers or gifts. Transfers that are made while the donor is still living. These may not be of the same order of magnitude as inheritances on an individual case, but in terms of their collective impact as well as their timing, they can have a great deal of significance in terms of enabling subsequent generations to accumulate more. And then the third thing is the general absence of certain types of economic anxieties that arise as a consequence of growing up in a home that is well situated financially. So, so those three considerations come into play, and I think that they ultimately have a non-linear or non-additive effect on subsequent generations' access to resources and wealth building opportunities. So if we observe a racial gap in the context of that kind of theoretical explanation for differences in wealth, the racial gap must be attributable to the fact that Black and white parents and grandparents have very different capabilities for transmitting resources across generations because they have very different resources. And so what accounts for the gap in resources between Black and white households ultimately It's a history of social policies that have been conducted in the United States that have promoted white accumulation of wealth and promoted Black decumulation of wealth. What are those policies? Well, I'd like to start with the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, in which the formerly enslaved were promised 40-acre land grants as restitution for the years of bondage. And that was a promise that was not kept. Simultaneously, the federal government introduces the Homestead Act of 1862, which eventually, I think by 1930, provides 160-acre land grants to 1.5 million white families. That 1.5 million figure would constitute approximately 10% of the white population in the United States circa 1900 and 1910. And that's a substantial proportion of the white population that received this kind of what we might call free equity from the federal government. Trina Shanks Williams at the University of Michigan has estimated that 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of those Homestead Act land patents to the present day. In addition, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the nation adopts a policy of legal segregation that is sustained for close to a century. And during the course of the period of legal segregation, which obviously had adverse effects on Black wealth accumulation, you also had a series of upwards of 100 white massacres that took place all across the country, ranging from locations like Fort Bend County, Texas, to Chicago, Illinois, to Wilmington, Delaware, to Wilmington, North Carolina, to Bisbee, Arizona, and so on and so on. And in the course of these 100 massacres, and I think the one that's probably most familiar to people now is the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, but in the course of these 100 massacres, not only were Black lives taken, but Black-owned property was seized and appropriated and made the property of the white terrorists themselves. So this further accentuated the racial wealth gap. And then the policies in the 20th century that I think are most pertinent include the transition from the federal government engaging in asset building by land distribution to pursuing asset building by supporting home ownership. But this transition was conducted in a highly, highly discriminatory fashion. And so as a consequence, you had the introduction of redlining as a public-private partnership between the Federal Housing Administration and local banks that denied Black households the capacity to acquire credit, and particularly to acquire credit that would permit them to become homeowners. And then you had the GI Bill that comes into operation in the immediate aftermath of World War II, where the home buying provisions of that legislation were overwhelmingly applied to white returning veterans from the war and denied Black returning veterans from the war. The last set of 20th century policies that are relevant to the production of the racial wealth gap are the policies that are associated with urban renewal in the 1950s and 1960s in particular, which included the running of freeway systems through the heart of Black communities, frequently destroying Black business districts. And I live in Durham, North Carolina, which is a case in point of that type of policy impact. So wealth inequality in the United States overall is extreme. The racial wealth gap is extreme. And the origins of the racial wealth gap are tied very, very closely to federal social policies that produced asset building opportunities for white Americans while denying them for Black Americans.